Hey, shalom, 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 makam, which is peace unto you all. Hayawam tawab la atam, za'ach yakam yawaman rachagado Charlotte, which is good day. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kayaham la katashamayim kwarab. Repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la, but now we Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. Bahasham rachak wadash wamashana. Laza konim nawa. Wamala akim sharachagadal, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is Isaiah chapter 61, and we'll get verse 1. All right, in the subtitle, it says, the exaltation of the afflicted. All right, verse 1, it says, the Spirit of the Lord power is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. All right, reading it again, it says, the Spirit of the Lord power is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek, in which ultimately, the men of the Lord have ultimately been dispatched and appointed to preach this word. Let me get this real fast. This is Jeremiah, chapter 1, and we'll get verse 5. And it says, before I formed thee in the belly, I'm going to start from verse 4. Jeremiah 1 and 4 says, then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Because ultimately, the prophets are sent, to preach unto the nation of Yasha Allah. All right, with, the 1/3 subscribing to the message of salvation and repentance. All right, and 2/3 are ultimately, they disdain this word. All right, but then also the prophets are sent unto the nations to tell them of their impending doom and judgment. All right, so reading this again, Isaiah 61 and verse 1, it says, the Spirit of the Lord power is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek, in which those good tidings it goes into the gospel, the good news. All right, it's good news to ultimately understand that, we're going to be delivered from, the situation that we're in. All right, which the 1/3 are going to be delivered, from the second death. All right, 2/3, they're going to have to go through that second death to be, purged and cleansed of their wickedness. All right, but they'll be, brought back in the kingdom, so they're ultimately going to get rest in the kingdom. All right, so it says, hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. All right, and which ultimately, it's this word that binds up those that are brokenhearted. All right, let's get that word for brokenhearted. And it says, brokenhearted, it says shabar, it says to break in pieces, break in or down. It says rend violently, wreck, crush, to break. It says be maimed, to be broken, be crushed. And ultimately, that symbolizes, or that's specifically going into the elect, because the scriptures say that the Lord is, roughly paraphrasing. Let me get this real fast, because I don't want to butcher it. This is Psalm chapter 51 and verse Psalms 51 and verse, give me a second. Psalms 51 and verse 16, it says, for thou desirest not sacrifice, else would I give it. Thou delightest not in burnt offering. It says the sacrifices of the Most High are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O Most High, thou wilt not despise. So ultimately the elect is in that mindset of, being contrite. Let's get that word for contrite. And it says daka, and it says to be crushed, collapsed. It says to crush to pieces. It says to collapse physically or mentally, so the elect ultimately is in the spirit of collapsing and breaking. All right, and it says physically or mentally, because you got 2/3. All right, they're now ultimately in that mindset of being contrite, and being contrite ultimately goes into not loving the rudiments and the ways of this world, because you got 2/3, they love the ways of the world. All right. The elect ultimately are in the spirit of sighing and crying, you see, because this ultimately isn't a way to live. All right. So ultimately, going into, being broken and contrite. Let's get some more. It says to be broken to pieces, to be crushed. It says, and he crushed, excuse me, it says to break to pieces, to crush, to be broken. It says crush, and ultimately, the elect is in that spirit as well, because on this side, we can't serve the Lord 100%. You know, the elect ultimately much more so will want to have those new bodies. The elect long for the kingdom. All right, and that ultimately goes into that broken and contrite spirit. Understanding that on this side we can't keep the law 100%. That puts one in the mindset of that puts one in the mindset of having a broken and contrite spirit. But going back, Isaiah 61 and verse 1. All right, finishing out. It says, he hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives. All right, in which it's this truth that ultimately liberates us. All right, because whereas, Esau, gave black culture, nigga culture, all right, gang culture, so on and so forth. All these things are ultimately traps and manacles or handcuffs to the mind. All right, it's ultimately this word that liberates us and frees us. You see, because we're not supposed to be black, Latino, Native American. We're supposed to be Yasha Allah, He Prince Power, and that ultimately is what elevates our vibration. All right, and that ultimately goes into that liberty. All right, let me get this word for liberty, and it says darawar, and it says free run, liberty. All right, it says outflow, it says pure. So because when you put yourself in the mindset of being black, all right, that's a box. All right, you can only be an athlete, a rapper, all right, an entertainer, a comedian. All right, it's a box. Whereas when we think in the mindset of the scriptures, all right, that ultimately allows for us to spread forth our roots and righteousness, and ultimately put us to where we're in our correct position in serving the Lord. Because it's more to life than just being a rapper, an entertainer, all right, and an athlete. So going back, finishing out, it says, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, all right, and the different captivities that Jake has been scattered to ultimately are prisons. All right, they're likened unto prisons, you see, because they spiritually and physically keep us enslaved. All right, so let's get this. Let's get Nahum chapter 3, and we'll get verse 1. And it says, woe to the bloody city. It is all full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not. All right, reading it again. Woe to the bloody city. It is all full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not. All right, in which that bloody city, it says woe. All right, so misery and destruction to the bloody city. When you look at America, Babylon, and Great, it's likened unto spiritual Nineveh. How this place was incepted was through rape, robbery, and murder. It says it is all full of lies and robbery. All right, how this place was ultimately incepted. All right, it was full of lies. All right, they'll say, oh, well, they discovered this land. Well, how Esau deals with a forked tongue. Discovery meant, he came over here, he did a lot of killing, all right, and essentially, he took things that wasn't his, all right, i.e., the land, all right, and everything that came with it. So being that he took the land, he was able to, spread forth his witchcraft and deception in his history. All right, that's why it's called history, his story. Esau's telling his story, all right, in his school systems. It says the prey departeth not. Jake isn't able to physically or spiritually depart from this place. Only the elect is able to spiritually depart from this place. All right, but how this place was designed, all right, the prey going into the Israelites, all right, because this place was set up as again a trap. All right, mentally, you see, because what's pushed is, okay, you have to choose this path. You have to be an entertainer. You have to be a comedian. You have to go to college. All right. If you don't fit that, ultimately, that makes you a prey. All right. Isaiah 59 and verse 15, and he that departed from evil maketh himself a prey. All right. So it's damn near double prey, you see, because just by default, we're already in this predicament, being that we went off against the Lord, but just speaking in reference to Esau, Edom, ultimately he set it up as a double trap. All right. And which really is again, we're just playing out our punishment, you see, but right now we're in a time to where, the Lord is ultimately reversing the curses and placing them upon our enemies. All right, and the elect ultimately, spiritually, is departing. That's why it says in Micah chapter 2 and verse 10, arise, ye, and depart, for this is not your rest, because it is polluted, it shall destroy you even with the sword of destruction. So ultimately it's the elect that ultimately are subscribing to departing spiritually out of this place until the Lord Yahweh Shai ultimately redeems the elect, from this said predicament. All right. But continuing on, Isaiah chapter 61. All right, we'll get verse 2. And it says, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our power, to comfort all that mourn. All right, so let's get Romans. Let's get Romans chapter 13. All right, we'll get verse 11, and it says, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. So ultimately it says, going back, Isaiah 61 and verse 2, it says, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of the vengeance of our power, to comfort all that mourn. So let me get this in the NLT. And it says, he has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it the day of the Most High's anger against their enemies. And essentially, that represents, the time period, that we're fastly approaching. So it is high time to awake out of sleep, because our salvation is nearer than when we believe. So each day, all right, we're seeing that, the prophecies take place. So that's allowing us to see that, we ain't got too much time left. We should be in the spirit of ultimately putting off that old man, all right, and putting off the rudiments of this world. Let's read that again, Romans chapter 13, all right, and we'll get verse 11. And it says, and knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believe. So going back to Isaiah chapter 61 and verse 2, it says, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the vengeance of our power. We're fastly approaching that. All right, we're seeing the signs, the prophecies. All right, we're seeing, famine looming. All right, the wars, the rumors of wars. All right, so we understand that the vengeance of our power is fastly approaching. It says to comfort all that mourn. So being that all of this is taking place, all right, this word is still out here to comfort those that are mourning, and those that are mourning is the elect. All right. Let's get this. Let's get Isaiah chapter 63. And we'll get verse 4, and it says, for the day of vengeance, excuse me, it says, for the day of vengeance is in mine heart. I'm going to start from verse 1. It says, who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength, because it says traveling in the greatness of his strength, because the Lord is going to be on that father's ship, the Lord Yahweh Shai. It says, not I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save, because he's coming to deliver his elect. Verse 2, wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat? I've trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me. For I will tread them in mine anger, and trample them in my fury, and their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment. And that's symbolic for all the judgment and killing that the Lord is going to do, because he's not happy, all right, with how this place is being ran. And that's why the scriptures say that, he's coming to wound the heads over many countries. All right. Verse 4 says, for the day of vengeance is in mine heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. So the Lord is anticipating, his return, all right, to ultimately, deliver his elect, all right, and place judgment upon, 2/3 in the heathen, all right. So I'm gonna get one more, and that'll be it. But this is let me get this. This is Matthew chapter 5, and we'll get verse 4. And it says, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. All right, in which the Lord deals in righteousness. The Lord is just. The Lord is balanced. A false balance is an abomination. All right, and it's ultimately true balance is just. All right, and it's righteous. To mourn. All right, and then to be comforted. All right, whereas the elect on this side are ultimately mourning in the kingdom. All right, and that transition phase, the elect is going to be comforted. All right, that's true balance. Whereas 2/3 on this side, they're ultimately mourning literally, but figuratively and metaphorically. They're in their kingdom. They're in their heaven. So which they'll get their rest in the kingdom. You see, but they have to get that that they got to go through the second death. All right. But verse 4 says, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And ultimately, the elect is going to be comforted. All right, starting with this word. All right, and then going forth into the kingdom. All right, so let's get one more. Let's get Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1. All right, because we got Isaiah 61 and verse 2. It says, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our power, to comfort all that mourn. All right, this is Isaiah 40 and verse 1. It says, comfort ye, my people, say of your power. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So we sinned. All right, we went off. All right, so it was just that we went into captivity. You see, but now we in a time to where the Lord is ultimately, again, he's placing the curses upon our enemies. All right, and that as this is going on, all right, the prophets are out on the highways and byways speaking comfortably, all right, bringing out this wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, and that's ultimately what's providing for that rest. All right, reading verse 2 again, it says, speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem. So it's comforting, all right, when you're going through some type of trying time to hear those good words, and those good words goes back to that good news, that gospel, all right, the scriptures. It says, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So those are those good words, that essentially our warfare is accomplished. All right. Essentially, the Lord is giving us that rest, in which that ultimate rest is going to be in the kingdom. So just wanted to go into that. Adawan Tazaza Banaya Pa, Lord, with us a beautiful edification to the spirit. Adawan Taza Atam Yashi Yawam Tawab, Lord, as well. You have a good day. Washalam Makam, which is peace and to all. Shalom, shalom.